As I have been standing here, I've been thinking back to the last war, when the bombing was on, and we heard that there was a heavy bombing around St. Paul's Cathedral. So I immediately, I walked over here and I stood down the road there. Every building, bar St. Paul's, was ablaze. And I said to myself, the hand of God is on St. Paul's. And this morning, I went to church and I was praying to God about you all. And I thought I would wander over and see what was happening. You have every right in this world to make a protest and to create a situation.
I think there's certainly a disparity of justice going on, which is a theme that's been occurring really for centuries, but when it starts affecting the middle class, people notice that there are multi-tiered justice systems, and some people have always been getting away with the worst crimes, and some others never get away with anything. It's becoming quite noticeable in the States and in Western developed nations now how there are multi-tiered justice systems, but it's no different than the past. It's just that the middle class used to not be part of the lower justice tier, and the lower justice tier has expanded to include them.
We have an emergency of sociopathy on the top of this pyramid I'm mentioning. Like, the people are truly not empathizing with any social argument or any, I mean, they're living in another world, in a world of segregation.
Why would people trust the banks? I mean, it's just common sense that people have gathered together to express anger at the way that things are.
I kind of believe in free market stuff, but even if you don't, even if you're far on the left, you're a greenie or whoever you are, we all kind of hate the banks right now. You know, they're parasitical. They don't deserve the money that they make.
We are going to need better tools for dealing with a lot of the volatility that we see in the world. We're going to need these anti-fragile systems, these systems that can withstand short, sharp shocks. 3, 2, 1.
I guess that's a criticism on like the hippy-dippy movement for peace without any kind of the evils of monetary exchange, when monetary exchange empowers individuals on a very basic level.
It's not a way that we can continue. And really, I think the goal is not to save the world, you know, because some people don't want to be saved. What we have to start to do is to start to think how we can carve out a safe operating space for the future where we as freedom-loving people can survive, thrive, and grow.
The idea was how to introduce a kind of like hyper-real antagonistic symbol to what we see as a hyper-real order, one that would just induce endless reversions and cycles of trouble that couldn't be answered in traditional ways. So it'd be one thing to just give you a gun, well, you just get arrested, right? But to give you the capacity or potentiality of a gun in the internet, in its kind of infinite replicability and ever-presence, all over the world, was a challenge that a kind of gift that the world system just couldn't respond to.
As long as the code pays for its own execution, it'll keep running in the network. And I think that opens up far more possibilities than we've considered today.
Isaac Newton was an explorer, and his tinkering with things that didn't work gave him a great sense of what would work. So he was an innovator, a scientist, a hacker.
What a hacker is today, it's a very debated, described, over-described. We have books coming out on hackers. We have marked our presence in history as a culture, as a cultural movement. And I think we have marked it very well so far, although we have losses and we have things to really worry and people to remember. Yet, I think we achieved already a good position, and the next iteration, our bigger danger is to be too self-referential, to not recognize the agency of other people, of other areas of expertise. And again, the fact that we are social animals, that isolationism is not an answer for well-being, for the welfare that we look for everywhere. So we have to go a little bit more social.
There's many people all over the world have worked towards from Cairo to London.
To me, this brings back Phil Zimmerman, who was the guy that originally wrote Pretty Good Privacy, which was the mother of all crypto inventions. So he took this work from academia and from the military, turned it into this package that offered military-grade encryption for civilian email, and basically fired the first shot in this kind of 20-year cypherpunk war. And, Zimmerman fought like hell for about 5 years with the US government. They used to have to take the source code of PGP, print it out into books, export the books, and then scan it again to get through a technical loophole with the US law about banning the export of cryptography software, but it was no longer considered software if it was in the form of a book. And, the fact that the government was willing to go to these extraordinary lengths to try and control cryptography was an indicator that cryptography was fundamentally important. And here we are now, 20 years later, we're up to our eyeballs in the Snowden problem. This was exactly the problem that Zimmerman was aware of as a potential, and he turned out to be exactly right in practice. But because we never mass deployed civilian cryptography of a high enough standard, we turned out to have almost no defense against the government when it came to this huge power grab that they've made.
Professor Lawrence Lessig, who in 1999 wrote his book entitled Code is Law, technically it's Code, and other laws of cyberspace, but really the mantra that came out of that was Code is Law. The second is Gabriella Coleman, an anthropologist and scholar of hacker communities and online activism, who has written about code and activism and how code and free speech really align. And we saw over the past, I'd say, almost 2 decades, this evolution where people didn't merely view computer code or the infrastructure that's built up around that as something that's external, like a bridge, but instead people viewed it as a means of expression.
I think there's a rather large symbiosis between the hacker community and the WikiLeaks community. The hacker community tends to regard truth and transparency as sacred values. So it's kind of a net generation values thing. I don't think they're two separate communities.
At the same time in which WikiLeaks leader Julian Assange, was awarded with the Sam Adams Prize for Integrity in Intelligence, for the first time a known military person was awarded this prize, opening up effectively in history the debate for what we need to do to actually evolve the way intelligence works in our time, cutting off without a sentence that way to actually receive donations from people that appreciate that effort. That has been a fundamental violation of network neutrality as it's perceived by most hackers around. It is a violation of even more than network neutrality, because what we call network neutrality is the politics of the internet. That is a violation of a neutrality that we attribute to a network, the network of money, on which the promise of capitalism is based on. That we can't just look over and just go on with. That's what most hackers thought.
What someone does with their own time and money is certainly one of the ways that they convey their personality to the world. And just as I can use my words to convince other people of something that I believe in, I can also use my money to help fund a project for something that I believe in. I don't think there's any material difference between those two things.
The WikiLeaks financial blockade woke a lot of people up to how unhealthy it is that the United States-based financial system essentially has a finger of death that they can point at any organization worldwide. And that is a serious vulnerability. That is an unacceptable single point of failure. That essentially means that the US government holds a kill switch for everybody's organization. Let that sink in for a minute.
People like stories. I also like stories. So if you go to the internet, you're going to see all these stories of how money was developed. Somebody invented it, but it never happened like that, right? It's like language. It was developed in many different parts of the world. Nobody fought, nobody sat and said, okay, I'm going to think about the concept of money. I'm going to invent currency. It didn't happen. Then that's why it's so hard to understand it, because it's just intuitively, as humans, we use this thing.
Right, can you tell me if most of the banks in Europe are owed money by the other banks and the other states in Europe, plus a few outside, how can they all raise each other out of the swamp when each one that props up another one will, by doing so, go down itself?
It's just not something people ever questioned before or wondered about. I mean, I asked people, you know, in all sorts of countries, in your high school, you know, your secondary education, did they ever sit down and explain to you how money comes into existence? And I haven't found a single education system yet where that's discussed as part of the core curriculum.
It's a complicated issue. Do we want to teach people, or do we want people to learn about the nature of currencies, the nature of payment systems, the nature of local currencies? I think the answer would be, it would be good to teach them about it, but we're facing an uphill battle. And the reason fundamentally comes back to the state's desire to hold a monopoly over the payment systems.
Currency is not absolute. It changes over time. And while right now we tend to have a dominant idea of what currency means, that's not been the same throughout history. And currencies have risen and fallen.
But there was a book recently where they actually did inventory of alternative currencies, around 6,000, such as one with the WIR in Switzerland. It's been around since 1932. You have the Lemais coin with the Lakota Indians in northwestern United States. You could even say some types of point systems, reward. So you have many different types.
Certain Kenyan tribes in the past used to trade with cowrie shells because it was a limited currency, so it was a good medium for exchange.
But let me get to your main question, which was this relationship between, say, alternative currencies and debt. So one thing that's interesting when you look at things like the level of debt following World War I, where debt levels kind of climb, of course, leading up through the Great Depression, after World War II, and again today, as you see these kind of spikes in debt levels. And alongside that, you have the introduction of new types of currency, new alternative currencies during the 30s and 20s. After the war, during the war, there's other examples of alternative currencies. Certainly, one of the most famous, of course, is in Berlin, following the collapse of the the Nazi regime, the use of cigarettes and alcohol as an alternative currency. And then today, with this massive buildup in debt outside of any war, which is one big difference between today and the 1940s and the 1920s and 30s. We didn't have a world war, yet we have World War levels of debt. You've again seen a large proliferation of alternative currencies.
What tends to happen, and we've seen this process many times over history, as the economy dives because of problems in the way the economy has been managed centrally, local currencies start to emerge like mushrooms after rain. And they pop up in all the little different towns where people have discovered that, oh gosh, the bread maker's here, but he's got no work. The butcher is here, but he's not selling any meat. The hairdresser's there, but nobody can afford a haircut. So the people will realize that all these people are here. If they can just have a token that circulates locally, they can get a little bit of trade going so that the meat flows, the bread is made, the haircuts are done, and all of the local traders can actually get a little bit of activity going. Everybody's there and waiting to work, but nobody's got some cash. So we'll create some cash and give it to the people. So if you like, let systems and local currencies are local quantitative easing. They're quantitative easing that bypasses the banking system and gets right down to the people.
This is called fractional reserve banking. They need to keep 10% of the money in the account back with them. And they say, well, because someone owes us that money, technically we have that money. So then they loan someone else 9 million of that, and then they loan the next person 8,100,000, and so on down the line. And then they've effectively laundered millions and millions of pounds worth of cash just off this 10 million that they were legally allowed to create.
A great Ponzi scheme.
A great Ponzi scheme.
And the human mind is perfectly able to deal with a huge amount of coins rather than just one fiat currency and a single note design and a single coin design. We can do even more than that, but we forgot it. Over time we got used to this central system. But we can go back to the other system if we want.
The world of finance is extremely jealous of its territory. As soon as they see a version of finance popping up, even if it's just a little internet toy payment system, they get rather aggressive. Phone calls are made, the central bank is annoyed, the FSA is annoyed, the various regulators are annoyed, and they are pushed to do something about it. In the late 90s, after DigiCash, there were a lot of different ventures starting up and getting into the business, and a lot of them failed, partly because they got no support from the finance people. One particularly famous system was eGold. eGold started up in about 97 doing gold on the internet, and built up its base up until about 2000 or so, when it started to become profitable and started moving forward. Unfortunately, eGold got into trouble, came to the attention of the feds, and the feds walked in there with weapons, SWAT team and so forth, and took them down. After a period of 2 years worth of court cases, the whole thing was basically rolled over, and although eGold was still running, huge numbers of accounts had been seized, nobody particularly trusted it, and nobody particularly trusted the result. In essence, it was shut down.
Getting rid of a network's a different matter than your hard drive failing or a subpoena against a server.
The problem with our classical view of payment systems, Alice pays Bob but goes through Ivan, a server, is that somebody, it doesn't have to be the state, it can be anybody, can attack the server and shut it down, or steal the money, or etc., etc.
Because we couldn't do decentralized currencies, we did centralized ones.
And here's where Satoshi Nakamoto had his, shall we say, his genius stroke. Let's not use some sort of heuristic. Let's not use some sort of algorithm. Let's not use some sort of hierarchy. Let's do a lottery. Let's create a lottery. We don't care which of the transactions goes forward, as long as it's only one of them.
I kind of have been calling myself a decentralist, which is this notion of
preventing anyone from having so much power.
We don't really care anymore which transaction was accepted. We only care who's got the biggest number. And that is something that we can guarantee cannot be spoofed, cannot be attacked, because the calculation of the hash, the proof of work thing, is this magical cryptographic blah, blah, blah.
Not depending on traditional cryptographic security, but really depending on economic incentives to encourage good behavior. And as long as they work on a macro scale, the whole system remains secure and has this distributed consensus property.
So if I give it an input, which is different, I cannot create that big number without going through massive amounts of processing. Everybody is therefore on the same footing. It is therefore a lottery, a fair lottery across all of the machines. One person gets to win the lottery. They get paid their 25 bitcoins for that. And that person is the one who chooses which transaction goes through, and therefore we've solved the double spending problem.
Messages are sent on a best effort basis. Nodes can leave and rejoin the network at will, whilst trusting the longest proof of work chain whilst they were gone. This is all about what happens when we turn our backs on the system.
Here's the difference. If we had a 51% solution in an election, like in a democratic election for a political party, that 51% would be able to temporarily, in a democracy without any other checks and balances, seize control of the governing body and make changes. What changes could they make? A coup would go too far. So they would probably be subtle changes, but in most democracies, those changes would reverberate through 4 years of governance until they get kicked out. Well, in Bitcoin terms, that's 10 minutes. And in those 10 minutes, all they can do is double spend a few transactions. The broader issue would be if you had a sustained 51% attack whose primary motivation would be to change the core protocol, essentially pull a coup on Bitcoin by changing the mechanics of the core protocol. In order to do that, you would not only need a 51% attack, but you would have to make that coincide with an upgrade of the system so that the majority chain actually moved to a different version of the protocol or to a different version of the software. That scenario is impossible. And the reason it's impossible is because it's not just the miners who have part in the consensus system, especially when we're talking about protocol changes. The miners can affect what is the longest block, but in order to affect which is the prevailing software choice, they have to persuade the users to change, and they have to persuade the web wallets that represent millions of users to change, and they have to persuade the merchants to change. If the miners were to take the protocol in the direction that the users don't want to go to, they would find themselves on the majority chain, but they would find themselves on a majority chain empty of transactions because all the users would stay behind. A minority chain with actual transactions and merchants is the majority chain because that's where the value is. And so you can't really hijack Bitcoin the software and Bitcoin the algorithm or any cryptocurrency with a 51% attack long-term in a coup, because you would lack the consent of the user wallets and the web wallets and the merchants who wouldn't follow you down that path because it would be obvious.
I said, sure, I want to know about Bitcoins. Apparently I had some at that point, and it's like somebody had sent them to me, but I didn't really know anything about them, and they were kind of in some wallet someplace on the internet. But I'm like, sure, I want to know about them. So he came up and we had lunch with Gavin Andreessen. And we had lunch with him at a Thai restaurant, and actually I picked up his tab and he paid me back in Bitcoins when he got home. So he sent me the Bitcoins, and they were worth 25 cents at the time. And I guess if he had a $9 tab, we're talking about 36 Bitcoins, which are worth getting on up to about $4,000 right now. So It was a very profitable lunch for me, and I'm glad that Gavin came out. But so we learned about Bitcoins that day. He talked about them. We were a little skeptical. We were like, well, you know, there's been a lot of alternative currency ideas floated about in the libertarian community before, but you know, we're interested. So we talked about them on the air, and I think it was that night, and it might have been the night after. I'm not 100% sure.
Let's look at it just like as a small phenomenon. It was people that were going on online servers, like casinos, playing among themselves, and actually the service providers had nothing to do with them, their community, their money, and what they played and what they loved playing. So they just wanted to play by themselves. They just wanted to have a channel to have transactions among themselves as promised by the game and go on and play it. These people got very early, in a very early stage, involved in Bitcoin because of a need, because of a felt grassroots need. Now, pardon me if you have like really strong political beliefs that grassroots must be only people fighting for social justice, but I think that we must also see some constituency into the fact that people are coming out of the system in a transversal way of the system that forced them into entering the temples, the palaces of the automatized administration of their games and build their own little community.
Yes. That's why I'm interested in it, is because it is a brilliant way of resistance without violence. These are usually the best ways to change people's minds, because if you have to get violent, then it's very easy for the opposition to vilify you, and often with very good cause.
Bitcoin doesn't have a strong property right that allows top-down control of the Bitcoin systems. Because it was originally written in a very anarchist form where it was run by voluntary cooperation, there is no owner of Bitcoin. So if Bitcoin had been developed by a proprietary company, Bitcoin Inc., there'd be no denying that when it came push meets shove, the property right would decide who was in charge and Bitcoin Inc. would own the Bitcoin network.
The kind of anarchist vision is that community is very small in Bitcoin, I find, even though it was the community that maybe birthed it.
Our IRS, our tax office, has said that Bitcoin is property. New York State and California and others are trying to regulate Bitcoin as money. The SEC that deals with securities is looking at Bitcoin as technology for stocks and equities. The CFTC is looking at it as a means of futures. The Fed is looking at it as a new form of central banking and issuing money. So I do believe Bitcoin is not just one thing. It's many different things to many people, but what's underlying it is this open source peer-to-peer network and protocol. And without that, you couldn't have any of these other uses.
Crisis, the word crisis actually has the same root as the word critique. So a crisis is at any moment in history when the status quo stops functioning. And so the natural result of a crisis, or the natural reaction, is a critique, which is where people come in and they point out why the system is not functioning properly, and they propose alternatives. So in that sense, of course, I mean, it's natural that the global financial crisis of 2008 and onwards, I don't know where you draw the lines, it's only natural that crisis sparked a critique. And I think Bitcoin is part of that critique. It's a group of people saying this is an alternative way of managing money.
Is effectively the future. And the faster we embrace it, the farther we will be ahead when the game changes.
In a world where we're increasingly moving away from physical cash towards more electronic transactions, you kind of start to need a digital equivalent of cash. And I think that's a really important role to play. So, but if you actually look, say, for example, cash in our current society, it probably only makes up, I guess, probably 3 to 5% of the money supply. I mean, I'm not sure if it's even that much. So it's actually quite a small part of the actual transactions that we do. but it is an incredibly psychologically important part of the transactions that we do. And without it, people would be very unhappy, I suspect. So Bitcoin can fulfill that role in the sort of, cashless world, kind of this digital version of this thing. That's a very positive thing.
My transactions are speech. Bitcoin assumes that I'm free to go publish those transactions. I'm free to tell other people about that information. Bitcoin assumes that data is easy to spread and hard to censor. That's a fundamental assumption in how Bitcoin works.
When I'm building my next business, I will not accept anybody else, in particular not for a foreign power, to hold a kill switch to my organization. So I think that blockade of WikiLeaks will have much more far-reaching implications for the price of Bitcoin and for the adoption of Bitcoin than what we've seen in these years, because it planted an idea that I don't like the concept of a kill switch to my organization. And people will start rebuilding that, and it'll take years before we see the full impact.
It's really exciting to be a part of this kind of opening up, if you will, of money to a wider conversation.
The great thing that came out of Bitcoin was the realization that we, the people, could do our own money. It doesn't matter who we are. We didn't have to go and get permission. We didn't have to run an audit. We didn't have to pay a fee. We didn't have to follow a rule book. We simply had to do it with a bit of software that got it up and going. And this is a huge opportunity to tell everybody that innovation belongs to us, and we can go out there and do whatever we want to as long as we can make the software work. We don't need to go back to history and say, oh, the British government has run the pound sterling for how many years? 3 centuries? Therefore we can't do money. No, that's all over. We can do money if we want to, if we can make it happen, if we can bring together a community to make it happen. That's a viable option now. That wasn't there before Bitcoin. Up until 2009, people like myself were working to produce these systems, and we got told over and over again we can't do that. Not that we believed it. It doesn't matter whether we were right or wrong. What it meant was there was no support, there was no market. Bitcoin has created a market in we can do something together. We can actually mediate these situations together.
£150 at 525, traded. Closing bell. Ring, 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 ring.
I didn't at first get it. I think I was in a place where I wasn't ready at the time. And then the second time I heard about Bitcoin, for some reason I decided to try and go to the source and read it from Satoshi Nakamoto's paper. And so I started reading Satoshi Nakamoto's paper, and I remember how at some point it just clicked. And I had this almost revelatory experience where I suddenly realized, oh my God, it's not a currency, it's a network. And I get networks and I understand networks. And not only is it a network, but it achieves something incredible. It achieves consensus, it achieves trust without centralized authority. This is so much more important than currency. It's so much bigger than currency.
When people talk about Bitcoin, they always talk about tech, it's fintech, it's all about the buzzword. It's not. All of the tools that Satoshi employs in the implementation of the Bitcoin in the Bitcoin white paper are all tools that were made before the year 2000, right? You've got Merkle trees, go back to late 70s. You've got public key infrastructure, what's that, the early 90s. And then you've got proof of work, Adam Back, 97, right? We could have done this 14 years ago if we'd really, really wanted it. But we didn't want it enough. And I think Any kind of system that allows two people to enter into an agreement with one another without requiring expensive court systems and expensive legal processes is a very, very powerful thing. Because if you're trying to say that justice is the preserve of the rich, then really what you're saying is there is no justice.
Triple entry takes us from this inside the corporate trusted scenario and extends it to other customers, to outside the company border, into other companies. Because what we can now do is cryptographically sign an entry. Alice signs her payment to Bob. It goes out to some intermediary, which could be the blockchain, could be a server, which gets signed again, and then goes across to Bob. And now we've got 3 entries which are sitting there. We've got Alice and Bob sitting with their primary copies, and if they have any dispute, Ivan or the blockchain is sitting in the middle, which guarantees that we've all got the same thing. And cryptography guarantees we've got it. The third party guarantees that it's not lost. So if Alice, for example, loses her copy, Bob can then say, well, that didn't exist. But Ivan can say, yes, it does exist. And this is where, for example, the presence or absence issue is solved by that third party, is solved by the blockchain. You can't lose an entry once it goes into the blockchain.
Step by step, it kind of makes sense. It's kind of crazy to go from like accounting to somehow making decentralized money happen by burning energy. It takes a while to get your head around, I find.
It allows these people to have a voice without having to be necessarily in the structural framework of the systems, right? They have created their own system, and if they like it, they're going to keep building on it.
It's really now that we're seeing the application of these things come to fruition. You know, tools. It's not just about Bitcoin as a payments innovation. Bitcoin is much more. It's something deeper. It's about tools of resource management, tools of organization and collaboration between people, the tools of self-governance, tools of trade and business. These things that we can use to rethink how we can construct the society around us to build systems that work better.
What I've seen people do is they will provide evidence, they'll go find evidence, and they'll use a blockchain to verify that the evidence existed at a given time. They'll use a public key and they'll timestamp it. And that's a really interesting way of creating this kind of, it's funny, we call it a paper trail, but it's not a paper trail. It's a trail based on public key cryptography that then can be referenced, not only by media outlets, but by anybody who's researching this topic.
We need the blockchain because we need to have a trust network. Like, that's super, super essential. We need to have a trust network so that we can carry information along supply chains without revealing keys, without revealing who exactly people are in a supply chain in order to not compromise competitive advantage. And we'll need to carry lots of different types of information, from verified certifications, perhaps, depending on a whole manner of things, but also information that perhaps isn't having a third party to agree it being correct. So more intangible types of information. And we need a system that can allow us to do that in a trustworthy way, which is what the blockchain provides so beautifully.
Similarly, I can envision a scenario in which people from not just Occupy, but any movement that want to have proof that a given, say, statement existed at a certain time frame, or that a given event happened, say either via video or media or otherwise, can use blockchain-based technology to have that verification. It could also be useful in refuting, say, media outlets, in tracking media coverage, and then you could envision a blockchain that could track the media coverage and then could be used every time something, say, comes up in media coverage that is false. You could have kind of trace that back to evidence showing that it's untrue.
The blockchain has this affordance that is so perfect for that problem, which is that it allows you to transfer information in a secure way, in a trustworthy way, without having to reveal exactly where that information came from, which basically transforms supply chain transparency completely.
If we're going to protect the past from the tyrants of the future, we need cryptography. And right now, the best available mechanism for protecting the past from the tyrants of the future is the blockchain. We can take what's happened already, we can secure it with vast amounts of supercomputer level computation or other cryptographic mechanisms, and at the end of that process, it does not matter how much a future tyrant wants to change that past, they just don't have a big enough computer to do the calculation to alter history. It is critically important that we protect the past from the future, because if we don't do that, in 50 or 100 or 200 years, Gandhi will never have existed. The ideas will be so dangerous, they'll be mopped out of reality, and algorithms will very carefully gloss over the holes. We must make sure that it is impossible for a future dictator to erase the history of humanity that might cause people to understand that the pain that they feel is a pain that has been felt for centuries before them and that can be cured by political action.
I see a lot of parallels with the early internet, and to me, Bitcoin is a platform, and it is not just one, but a series of protocols at a very basic layer. It is a peer-to-peer network for rapidly propagating blocks and transactions. On top of that, you have a TCP-like almost transaction layer within the scripting language inside the transactions. And already we're seeing other protocol layers above it. One of the things that people don't realize in retrospect, looking at the internet today, it appears as if it was the perfect protocol and that it never really had much competition. But that's not true. Even TCP/IP had plenty of competition and also plenty of criticism. Throughout the 90s, the prevailing attitude from the telecommunication providers was, this will never scale to the level of voice. It can't do quality of service. It can't do video. It can't scale to large levels. And that's why we need to continue using these legacy fiber optic networks. Today, all of those legacy fiber optic networks are running on top of TCP/IP. Turns out it could do voice, it could scale, and it did scale. TCP/IP is the story of a protocol that was good enough and reached the scale where it achieved viral network effect and embedded itself in computer science curricula and in hardware and in software implementations, and became so successful that now we can't even upgrade it to IPv6 because it resists its own successor. I don't think we're going to see Bitcoin permanently displaced by a successor. I think Bitcoin is good enough. I think Bitcoin has achieved the viral network effect. And I think it has already absorbed enough investment that creates momentum and inertia that will take Bitcoin very far. I do expect to see lots of alternative currencies emerge. In fact, over time, I've revised my opinion, and now I believe that instead of hundreds or even thousands of alternative currencies, we're going to see hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of alternative currencies, and all the way down to single-person pseudo-currencies that are reputation management schemes or funding schemes for individuals. Novelty coins and fad coins and meme coins and coins created by 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds in school to trade with their friends. We're going to see millions of currencies. However, all of these currencies will come as successors to Bitcoin, and I think many of them, the ones that will achieve monetary value, will achieve it in collaboration with Bitcoin synergistically. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if we see several coins backed by Bitcoin, where Bitcoin acts as the reserve currency, as the store of value for long-term consideration. Over time, we may see Bitcoin be used mostly for very large value transactions, very much like the gold standard. And then more nimble currencies take on a more transactional role for day-to-day purchases and things like that. But if they do so, they only strengthen Bitcoin. They don't replace it.
Imagining the future, on what it means futurism today, and on what it really means to envision society thriving with humans in there in the future. Now, I'm not asking for purity at all. I love cybernetics and the Cyborg Manifesto by Donna Haraway and everything that came after that. So I think we can be transversal enough to cross several fields, but we have not to forget we are also humans and we live among humans. And the most fun we have is with humans, even not in front, even if you're a gamer, you have humans on the other side. And that's what makes it most fun.
Let me start with the quick story of what is the state. Max Weber's definition of the state is that the state is the entity that has the monopoly on violence inside of a bounded geographic territory. Legitimacy. So the problem is that in the places where you really need to identify the state, like say Gaza, this test fails. Because there is no monopoly on violence, but there are 4 or 5 entities that all act like the state, and to all intents and purposes there are many states sharing a single territory. There's no monopoly on violence, but there's plenty of guys with guns running around telling you that they're in charge. So I prefer to say that the state is any entity that can retroactively pardon a crime. If you pardon murder, you get an army. If you pardon assault, you get police. If you pardon theft, you get taxation. And this notion that there is a sovereign ability to change the rules for limited numbers of people and license them to do things which are otherwise criminal gives you a really clean definition of the state. The state is the thing that washes your hands when you do something which is inherently wrong. Then we look at this question of what do you do when the state breaks down, right? You go to refugee camps, you go to civil wars, you go to any situation where everything has gone wrong, and suddenly you've got this fundamental problem, which is, yes, we can't really organize without the state, we don't have anything which is washing hands, we don't have a police, we don't have an army, we don't have taxation, we don't have services, and it's all gone horribly wrong. Sometimes those situations self-organize and are reasonably functional, like Somalia under the Union of Islamic Courts, which allegedly had a pretty stable standard of living and not too much violence. But most of the time, everything just goes to hell in a handbasket and stays there, and the worst people in society wind up in charge, which is what you saw, for example, in most of the post-Soviet area, where the state withdrew and you just wound up with mafia and government fusing. Terrible situation. So state in a box is a pre-blockchain concept about having a bunch of software which, if you clip all the pieces together, allows you to do half a dozen or so of the core jobs of the state. It gives you property rights, it gives you identity registers, it gives you the possibility of taxation, it gives you electoral democracy, and a few other features like this. And you can imagine this as basically being a website that you log into with a secure ID token that is either biometric or tied to a biometric. And then once you've asserted that you are a citizen, you get to interact with the processes. Here's my bank account, I've made these transactions, I owe this much in taxes, it's been automatically deducted. Here are the bills that are currently being voted on, here are the people that I have asked to represent me on these issues, these are the decisions they've made, they're up for my approval. This is the patch of land that I own, on it there is a house, here's all the information about the people that are providing utilities to that house and the legal commitments that they have to me in exchange for my payments. And you could imagine a web interface that managed all of that stuff. Now that only works if your legal system is small, clean, simple, and rational. You can't take 70,000 pages of US tax code and put it into a website that an ordinary user can understand. It might even only work inside of refugee camps and similar crisis areas where the majority of the complexity has been washed out of the society by disruption, so you're kind of rebuilding from scratch and you just need something to get you through the first few years. As time passes, case law begins to build up and those systems become less effective. So what you get out of this is the idea that in the event that you've got a failed state, you come with a bunch of smartphones and a bunch of computers and a bunch of networking gear, and everybody gets a website that performs the function that they used to go to the state for. Ooh, that's a bit interesting. And then you think, well, okay, now we've got blockchains, it's not a website anymore, it's a distributed application. You could potentially run kind of state-like entities on something like Ethereum. Oh, yeah, you totally could. So, why would you want to do this? And the answer is, the same way of governing refugee camps is as if they were microstates. Self-government, participatory democracy, participatory budgeting, proper identity databases, proper healthcare, medical systems, and all the rest of these things, collective budgeting, collective bargaining. And all of the little enclaves where we've got a breakdown in external governance, where people want to be able to treat each other decently but don't have the machinery, could run on these kind of systems. Anytime you are under-governed, you set up a system, everybody votes, everybody cooperates inside of those systems, and what you get is the re-emergence of local control where central government has failed. And I think that we would see huge use of that in slums, we could see huge use of that in refugee camps, war zones, anywhere where there's been so much systemic disruption that you need software to take over from the government just to keep the basic functions going for long enough that you can stand up essential services again. And I think the world is filled with that. I think there are hundreds of millions of people or more that are systemically unable to access reasonable quality state services because of state failure, because of corruption, or because they're so poor that they're not putting anything into the state, and so the state just ignores them or tries to treat them like wildlife. State in a box is a way of allowing the citizens to patch the cracks where the conventional Westphalian nation state is failing to provide services.